Welcome back to the Weekly Education Pulse. I'm Sami.
And I'm Tony. Each week we break down the key developments shaping the international and independent school sector.
Yeah, this week we're seeing a shift that goes beyond individual markets or single school openings.
From private equity driving large-scale consolidation, to heritage school brands expanding globally, to regulation and investment reshaping competition.
Yeah, what's becoming clear is that education is no longer just growing, it's being structured, scaled, and strategically positioned.
And the 5 stories we're covering today each reflect a different part of that shift.
So let's get into it. And the first story that we're going to talk about is actually a bigger picture shift taking place across the global education sector. Private equity investment into education is accelerating, and we're now seeing a clear pattern of consolidation at scale.
Yeah, recent developments in Asia highlight this. KKR's reported acquisition of XCL Education, a Southeast Asian school group, is one example of how investors are now targeting established platforms rather than individual schools.
Yeah, and this is not happening in isolation. We've seen a series of major deals over the past 12 to 18 months that point to the same direction of travel.
The EQT-led consortium acquiring Nord Anglia Education in a deal valued around 14.5 billion, a Brookfield-led investment into GEMS Education, one of the largest school groups globally, and Hillhouse Capital acquiring Dulwich College International Asia's schools for around $600 million.
Yeah, so what we're looking at here is not just growth, it's the restructuring of the sector into a large, scalable platform.
That matters because when private equity enters this level, the focus shifts. It becomes about operational efficiency, expansion across markets, and building networks that can deliver consistent outcomes at scale.
And we're also seeing continued interest even after these deals are completed. For example, Mubadala's 600 million investment into Nord Anglia's portfolio shows that institutional capital still sees long-term value in these education groups.
And importantly, this is not limited to K-12 schools. Investment is also expanded into adjacent areas such as tutoring, supplementary education, further expanding the overall ecosystem.
So essentially, it's a structural shift. Education is no longer just being delivered by individual schools operating independently. It's increasingly being organized into groups, platforms, and networks backed by global capital.
And that raises an important question for the sector. As scale becomes more important, what happens to smaller independent schools that are operating outside these systems?
Yeah, because increasingly competition is not just about academic results or facilities, it's about access to capital, talent, global networks, and the ability to grow strategically.
And that's the shift. And that shift is something we're seeing reflected in several of the stories we're covering in this episode.
Yeah, and we'll jump to the next one. We're going to Vietnam, where rugby schools announced the launch of a new campus in Hanoi, set to open in September 2026. And this marks another step in the international expansion of one of the UK's most established independent school brands.
And it continues a pattern we've been tracking closely. British independent schools increasingly extending their reach into Asia, targeting markets with strong demand for international education and clear pathways to global universities.
Yeah, and Vietnam is particularly an interesting case. Over the past decade, we've seen rapid growth in the country's international school sector, driven by rising incomes, an expanding middle class. Growing, regulatory environment has become more open or more structured to allow investors to understand how to enter into the market. And also, there's just been a strong emphasis on education itself.
At the same time, Hanoi remains less saturated than Ho Chi Minh, which makes it an attractive entry point for new premium schools.
Yeah, and rugby is already present in Asia, being in Japan and Thailand. So this is not their first move into the continent. It's part of a broader strategy to build a network of schools that carry the rugby name, ethos, and academic approach into key growth markets.
And as with other UK brands, the value proposition goes beyond curriculum. It's about heritage, reputation, holistic educational model that combines academic rigor with co-curricular development.
But entering a market like Vietnam is not without its challenges. Competition is increasing, regulation continues to evolve, and schools need to carefully balance international positioning with local expectations.
So this is another example of a broader trend we're seeing, premium school brands expanding internationally, but doing so in a way that is increasingly strategic and market specific.
And it raises an ongoing question for the sector. As more heritage brands enter emerging markets, how much of their success will depend on brand strength alone, and how much on their ability to adapt to a local context.
Our second story takes us to Abu Dhabi, where ADEC has released its latest round of school inspection results for 25-26 academic year. These inspections provide a comprehensive evaluation of school performance across areas such as teaching quality, student outcomes, leadership, and importantly, well-being.
Yeah, and in a market like Abu Dhabi, these ratings carry real weight. They directly influence parental choice, school reputation, and in many cases, a school's ability to increase their fees.
What stands out this year is the continued spread between top performing schools and those still working to improve. We're seeing a concentration of outstanding and very good ratings among established premium operators, while other schools remain in the good or acceptable categories.
And those ratings, they reflect something quite important about the market. Abu Dhabi is becoming increasingly quality driven. Parents are more informed, expectations are rising, and regulatory frameworks from ADEC, their inspection system, are reinforcing that shift.
Also, how it highlights the role of regulation in shaping the sector. Unlike some markets where growth is driven primarily by demand, in Abu Dhabi, quality assurance mechanisms are actively influencing how schools operate and compete.
Yeah, and there are strategic implications to that. For school operators, inspection outcomes are no longer just compliance exercises. They're central to positioning, enrollment strategy, and long-term sustainability.
It also raises an interesting contrast with our first story. While rugby school is entering a growth market like Vietnam, here in Abu Dhabi, we are looking at a more mature ecosystem where success is increasingly defined by performance, not just presence.
And as more markets adopt similar inspection frameworks, this idea of regulated quality shaping competition, well, it's likely to become even more important across the international school sector. And next, well, we're going to stay within the Middle East and we're going to Egypt, where Uppingham School has announced plans to open a new campus in New Cairo, scheduled to launch in 2028. This will mark the school's first international campus, bringing another well-established UK independent school brand into the global market.
What's interesting here is the timing. Egypt is emerging as a key growth market for international and private education, particularly in areas like New Cairo, where large-scale residential developments are driving demand.
Yeah, and we're seeing a clear pattern here. Education is increasingly being integrated into these new urban developments, positioned as a core part of the value proposition of families moving into these new communities.
Creates an opportunity for international school brands. By partnering with developers or local operators, they can enter markets with strong built-in demand and clear target demographics.
But as with Vietnam, this is not just about exporting a curriculum, it's about exporting a brand, a heritage, and a particular educational philosophy.
And Egypt presents a very different operating environment. It is a large, complex market with a mix of national, bilingual, and international schools, and a wide range of price points.
Yeah, which means positioning becomes critical. Schools need to be clear about where they sit in the market, who they are targeting, and how they differentiate from both local competitors and other international operators.
And this is where the comparison with our first story becomes interesting. Rugby International School entering Vietnam and Uppingham entering Egypt. Both examples of UK brands expanding internationally, but they're entering very different types of markets, with different demand drivers and competitive dynamics.
Yeah, and that reinforces a key point there, is that there's no single blueprint for expansion. Success depends on how well the model is adapted to the local context, not just how strong the brand is globally.
Our final story takes us to Romania, where Mark Twain International School has announced a €30 million investment into a new campus in, just outside Bucharest. The development is expected to significantly expand the school's capacity and facilities, supporting its long-term growth plans.
Yeah, and this is a good example of something we're seeing more frequently across Europe, established schools reinvesting into infrastructure, not just to grow enrollment, but to strengthen their positioning within increasingly competitive markets.
Romania might not always be the first market that comes to mind for international education, but demand has been steadily increasing. Economic growth, rising incomes, and growing international-minded population are all contributing to that trend.
Yeah, and in cities like Bucharest, competition is intensifying. Schools are not just competing on curriculum anymore. They are competing on facilities, campus experience, and the overall value proposition offered to families.
Which is why investments like this matter. Now, 30 million euros campus is not just additional classrooms. It's about creating an environment that aligns with the expectations of modern international education.
And it links quite clearly with our earlier stories. Vietnam and Egypt, we're seeing new schools entering growth markets. And here, Romania, we're seeing an existing school doubling down on its position through capital investment.
Yeah, different strategy, same objective, to remain competitive in a market where expectations are rising and choice is expanding.
And it highlights something important. Growth in the sector is not only about expansion into new markets, it's also about strengthening position within existing ones.
And it brings us to the end of this week's episode.
Yeah, what stands out across these stories is how the sector is evolving in multiple ways at the same time.
On end, we are seeing global capital driving consolidation and the formation of large education platforms.
Yeah, and at the same time, heritage brands are expanding into new markets and established schools are investing to strengthen their position.
Alongside that, regulation continues to shape how schools compete, particularly in more mature markets.
So there's no single direction of travel. The sector is being shaped by different forces, each influencing how schools grow, position themselves, and compete.
It's what makes this space interesting and very complex, and increasingly strategic.
Yeah. So if there's a development in your region that we should be covering, please do get in touch.
We'll be back next week with another global update.
Till then, see you next time.